There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a great house in the hour before disaster. A silence so complete that even the servants seem to sense it, though none of them could ever say why. On the night of the 17th of October in the year 1813, that silence settled over Ashworth Hall like snow, soft and total, and nobody thought to be afraid of it. Lady Evelina Ashworth was 22 years old, and she had spent the whole of that final ordinary day doing nothing more remarkable than choosing ribbon. She sat in the morning room with 3 lengths of silk spread across her lap, one the pale blue of a winter sky, one the color of clotted cream, and one a deep, arresting rose that her maid, Mary Fenwick, kept sliding back into her hands whenever Evelina set it aside. "The rose, my lady," Mary said for perhaps the 4th time. "Lord Vane will not be able to look away from you in the rose." "Lord Vane," Evelina said laughing, "cannot look away from me in a coal sack. I have tested this. He is hopelessly devoted, Mary, and it is rather inconvenient, because now I cannot tell if I have good taste or if the man is simply blind with love." It was meant as a joke, the kind of light, careless thing a happy young woman says when she believes, truly believes, down to the marrow, that her life has been arranged correctly. And why should she not have believed it? She was the only daughter of Lord Reginald Ashworth, a baron of old but modest fortune, whose estate income was comfortable rather than dazzling, but whose name carried the particular weight that comes from 3 centuries of unbroken respectability. She was to be married in the spring to Lord Julian Vane, second son turned heir after his elder brother's death from fever 2 winters past, a man with a kind face, a gentle laugh and, more importantly to Evelina's father, though he would never have said so aloud, an income of 9,000 a year and a townhouse in Grosvenor Square. It was, by every measure that mattered to the world she lived in, a perfect life, arriving exactly on schedule. She did not know, as she held the rose silk up to the window light, that she would never wear it. She did not know that within 11 hours, everything she understood about her own existence, her name, her home, her future, the very ground she believed she stood on, would be gone, burned or stolen or simply revealed to have never truly been hers at all. She only knew that the ribbon was pretty, and that Mary was right about the rose, and that her father had promised to join her and her aunt for cards after supper, which he almost never did any more, not since the gout had settled into his knee and made him irritable in the evenings. "He seemed in good spirits today," Evelina said, half to herself. "Papa, did you notice? He was almost cheerful at breakfast." Mary, who was folding the discarded silks back into their paper, paused for just a moment too long before answering. "He did seem lighter, my lady?" "Yes." What Mary did not say, what Mary herself did not yet fully understand, though she had begun in the last fortnight, to feel a certain wrongness in the house, a certain quality to the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, was that Lord Ashworth's good cheer that morning was not the contentment of a man whose life was in order. It was the strange, brittle lightness of a man who has finally made a decision after months of dread, even if that decision is a terrible one. It is a particular kind of relief. The relief of someone who has stopped fighting the water and simply let it close over his head. Evelina spent the afternoon writing letters, one to her cousin Francis in Bath, full of gossip about the upcoming wedding, and one to Julian himself, though she would not send it, because a lady did not write too eagerly to her betrothed, however much she wished to. She walked in the garden as the light went gold and thin. She ate a small supper of soup and cold chicken with her Aunt Prudence, who lived with them since the death of Evelina's mother 9 years before, and who spent most of the meal complaining, gently and habitually, about the dampness getting into her joints. And then at 9 o'clock her father did not come down for cards. At first this seemed nothing at all. Aunt Prudence assumed his gout had worsened. Evelina assumed he had fallen asleep over his correspondence as he sometimes did. She went up herself, a little after 10, meaning to tease him gently for abandoning them, carrying a candle whose small flame threw long shadows up the stairwell, shadows that seemed, in later memory, to have been reaching for her even then, though of course that was only a trick the mind plays afterward, dressing up an ordinary evening in the costume of doom because we cannot bear for catastrophe to arrive without warning. She knocked. There was no answer. She knocked again and pushed the door open, and found her father's study empty, not merely unoccupied but empty, in a way that made her stand very still in the doorway with her candle trembling slightly in her hand. The desk drawers hung open. The small iron strong-box that had always sat beneath the window, the one that held the household's ready money and her mother's few remaining jewels, was gone entirely, not merely opened but gone, taken from its place as though it had never existed. On the desk, weighted down by an inkwell, was a single folded letter, addressed in her father's hand to no one at all. Simply, to whoever finds this first. Evelina picked it up. Her hands, she would remember later, were perfectly steady. It was strange, the things the body does in the seconds before the mind catches up to horror, how calm one can appear while standing at the very edge of the falling world. She broke the seal. She read 4 lines. And the ordinary day, the ribbon and the letters and the soup and the small complaints about damp weather, ended forever. The letter was short. Grief, Evelina would learn, rarely announces itself in long paragraphs. It comes in short, brutal sentences, the kind a man writes when his hand is shaking too badly to manage anything more. My dearest girl, by the time you read this I will be beyond your forgiveness, and I do not ask for it. I have ruined us. Not slowly, as a careful man ruins himself, but all at once, like a fool, because I believed, God help me, that I could win back what I had already lost. There is no money. There has been no money for above a year, though I let you believe otherwise, because I could not bear to see your face when you understood what your father truly was. Vane's family will learn the truth within days, and they will not want you now, not without a fortune, and I could not bear that either. Forgive me for being a coward twice over, once in the losing and once in the leaving. I have gone to settle the last of it in the only way left to a man with nothing left to give. Your father, who loved you more than his own life and proved it very badly. All right. Evelina read it 3 times before the words assembled themselves into meaning, and even then she did not fully believe them, not in the way one believes the sun will rise, not in the bone-deep way that lets a person act. She believed them only the way one believes a very bad dream while still half inside it, with the small persistent hope that a door will open and someone will shake her gently awake. No one shook her awake. She would learn the rest of it in pieces over the following hours, and then the following days, each piece worse than the last, arriving with the terrible momentum of a landslide that has already begun and cannot be called back. Her father, Lord Reginald Ashworth, had not simply mismanaged his affairs. He had, over the course of some 3 years, lost the family's entire liquid fortune at cards and at the racetrack. First small sums easily hidden, and then larger ones hidden with increasing desperation, until he had mortgaged first the townhouse in town, then the timber rights on the northern acreage, then finally, in the last 6 months, in a fever of denial that anyone who has ever watched a gambler in his final descent will recognize, the hall itself, the house Evelina had been born in, the house that had sheltered 5 generations of Ashworths before her. He had believed, as such men always believe, that one great win would restore everything before anyone had to know. He had gone to London 3 weeks prior under the pretense of business with his solicitor. He had, in fact, gone to a gaming house in St. James's, where he had staked the very last of what remained, money borrowed at ruinous interest from a moneylender named Josiah Crane, a man whose name Evelina had never once heard until it began to appear again and again in the horrified conversations of solicitors and creditors in the days that followed. He had lost that too. And so, on the night of the 17th of October, having exhausted every possibility, having watched the last of his family's 500-year inheritance disappear across a card table into the hands of strangers, Lord Reginald Ashworth had done the one thing he believed might spare his daughter the full weight of his shame. He had ridden out to the old stone bridge above the Avon, on the eastern edge of what had, until that morning, still technically been his land. They found his horse first, standing patiently by the parapet as though waiting for a rider who would never return to claim it. They found him 2 days later, a mile downstream, caught in the reeds near the mill. Evelina did not scream when the constable came to the house with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, unable to look at her directly as he delivered the words no daughter should ever have to hear. She did not weep, not then. She stood very straight in the front hall, the hall with its Ashworth portraits going back 6 generations, portraits that, though she did not yet know it, would be sold within the fortnight to satisfy a creditor's claim, and she said in a voice she did not recognize as her own, "Thank you. You may go." It was only after the door closed that her legs gave way beneath her, and Mary caught her before she struck the stone floor, and the sound that came out of Evelina then was not a scream at all, but something lower and worse, the sound of a person discovering all at once that the entire architecture of her life had been resting on nothing. Grief, cruel as it is at least a private thing. Society, Evelina would learn in the weeks that followed, does not permit even that mercy to a woman whose ruin has become public. The news reached Grosvenor Square before her father's body had even been brought home for burial. Such news always travels faster than sorrow, carried on the eager tongues of people who mistake gossip for concern. By the time Evelina, in her black morning gown, thought to write to Julian Vane, the man to whom she had been promised since she was 19 years old, the man who had held her hand in the garden at Ashworth Hall not 3 weeks prior and told her that he counted himself the most fortunate creature alive. By the time she thought to write to him, his mother had already written to her. The letter from Lady Vane arrived on the same morning as the undertaker. Evelina opened it standing in the front hall, still in her mourning black, with Aunt Prudence hovering anxiously behind her, and she read the words with the same terrible calm she had read her father's confession 4 days before. The strange numbness that settles over a person who has simply run out of capacity for new shock, and so receives it instead like weather. Something merely to be endured. My dear Miss Ashworth, it is with the deepest regret, and I assure you the very sincerest sympathy for your recent and terrible loss, that I must inform you the connection between our families can no longer be sustained. You will understand, I am sure, that a match founded upon expectations which have proven, through no fault of your own, I hasten to add, entirely without foundation, cannot in conscience proceed. My son is heartbroken, as any man of feeling would be, but he defers as he must, to the interests of his family and his name. I wish you every possible comfort in this difficult time and remain, with sincere condolences, Lady Vane. There was no letter from Julian himself. Not one line, not one word, from the man who had kissed her hand in the garden and called her his dearest girl and promised, with what she had believed was perfect sincerity, that nothing on earth could alter his devotion. She would learn months later from a source she trusted, that Julian had wept when his mother forbade the match, had in fact, argued for nearly 2 full days before finally, quietly giving way. It did not comfort her to know it. A man who weeps and yields is still, in the end, a man who yields, and Evelina had needed, in that terrible week, a man who would not. Not one word, she thought, standing in the hall with the letter trembling in her hand, not from grief this time, but from something colder and harder, something that would, in time, become the iron in her spine. 3 years and not one word from him. Only from his mother, as though I were an unfortunate line item to be struck from the household accounts. She did not cry over that letter either. She folded it very precisely in thirds and set it on the mantel, and went upstairs to help Mary begin sorting which of her gowns, if any, she would be permitted to keep. The answer, it transpired over the following fortnight, was very few. The hall's contents had been mortgaged along with the house itself in the final desperate months of her father's decline, a fact Evelina had not known and could not have known, since he had signed the papers alone in London, telling no one, not even his solicitor of 30 years, Mr. Aldous Fry, who arrived at the hall 3 days after the funeral looking as though he himself had aged a decade in the reading of the estate's true condition. My lady, Mr. Fry said. He still called her my lady out of old habit, though the title itself was already becoming a kind of cruel joke, since the barony, without an heir, would revert to a distant cousin in Yorkshire whom Evelina had met exactly once at her mother's funeral, and did not particularly wish to meet again. My lady, I have gone through every paper, every deed, every note of hand, and I must tell you plainly, because I believe you would rather have plainness than false comfort, that there is nothing left. The debts exceed the assets by some considerable margin. Everything, the house, its contents, the land, even, I am sorry to say, a portion of your mother's jewelry which your father pledged against a debt some 8 months ago, all of it must be sold to satisfy the creditors, chief among them a Mr. Josiah Crane, who has already sent his own man of business to inspect the property. And what? Evelina asked in the flat, careful voice she had adopted since the constable's visit, the voice that let her get through each conversation without her hands beginning to shake. Am I to be left with Mr. Fry? The old solicitor could not quite meet her eyes. There is a small sum, he said at last, held separately in trust from your late mother's marriage settlement, which your father, to his credit, never touched, whether from scruple or from oversight I cannot say. It amounts to some £40 a year. It is not nothing, my lady, but it is not. He stopped himself and began again more gently. It will not maintain a household. It will not maintain a lady's life as you have known it. I am so very sorry. £40 a year. Evelina sat very still and did the arithmetic that every gently bred young woman of the period was quietly trained never to need to do, and understood in that moment, with total and merciless clarity, precisely what her life had become. She was 22, unmarried, without a father, without a fortune, without a home, and, as she would discover within the month, when the invitations that had once arrived weekly from every fashionable drawing-room in the county simply stopped arriving at all, without, in any meaningful sense, a place in the world she had been raised to believe was hers by birthright. Society, she was learning, extends its warmth generously to those who need it least, and withdraws it entirely, with brisk and unembarrassed efficiency, from those who need it most. There is an old cruelty in the way a great house empties itself. It does not happen all at once, in one dramatic scene, however much the mind wishes to remember it that way. It happens in 100 small humiliations spread across many gray weeks, each one small enough to bear alone, and devastating in their accumulation. It was the auctioneer's men, arriving in their sensible brown coats to catalogue the furniture, running their hands over the mahogany dining table Evelina had eaten 1,000 meals at, calling out numbers to a clerk as though the table were nothing more than a table, rather than the place where her mother had once taught her, patiently at the age of 6, how to hold a spoon correctly. It was the portraits coming down from the long gallery, her great-grandfather in his old-fashioned wig, her grandmother in the blue silk that Evelina had always secretly thought she resembled, each one wrapped in sacking and carried out to a cart by men who did not know or care whose faces they carried, because to them it was simply canvas and gilt frame, worth so many pounds and no more. It was Mary, weeping quietly in the servants' hall, not for herself, though her own position was gone too, the whole household being let go with only a fortnight's wages by way of thanks for years, in some cases decades, of loyal service, but for Evelina, whom she had dressed and cared for since Evelina was a girl of 12, and who now had, in all the world, almost nothing left to give her in return. "I won't leave you, my lady," Mary said fiercely on the last night before the house passed formally into new hands, hands that belonged, in the strange irony of it, to a wealthy cotton manufacturer from Manchester who had bought the hall at a fraction of its true worth, precisely because a forced sale from a dead man's estate always sells cheap, and who intended, everyone said, to pull down half the east wing and build something more modern in its place. "I don't care what wages you can pay. I'll come with you wherever you go if you'll have me." Evelina, sitting on the floor of her nearly empty bedroom, surrounded by the handful of trunks that contained everything she now owned in the world, looked up at her maid. Her friend, she understood now, the word maid having become entirely too small a word for what Mary had become to her, and felt, for the first time since the constable's visit 3 weeks before, something crack open in her chest that was not entirely grief. "I cannot pay you anything, Mary," she said. "I have £40 a year and nowhere to live. You would be better served finding a position in a house that can actually keep you." "I didn't ask if you could pay me," Mary said, with the particular stubbornness of a Yorkshire-born servant who has decided a thing and will not be argued out of it. "I said I wouldn't leave you. Those aren't the same question, my lady, and you know it." And so, when Evelina left Ashworth Hall for the last time, on a grey morning in early November with a light rain falling that seemed, in its very mildness, like a final insult, as though the sky itself could not be troubled to weep properly for the ending of everything she had known, she did not leave entirely alone. Mary came with her, carrying one of the 2 remaining trunks, and together they took the mail coach to Bath, where Evelina's cousin Frances had, with evident reluctance disguised as sisterly duty, offered her a small room at the top of the house. The room, Evelina understood without being told, previously occupied by an unmarried governess who had recently left their employment. It was there, in that small cold room under the eaves, with a single window that looked out over the chimney pots rather than any garden, that Evelina began to understand the true shape of her fall, not as a single catastrophic night, though that night had begun it, but as a long, grinding, ongoing erosion of everything she had once believed herself to be. Frances was not unkind exactly, but she was constantly, wearingly aware of the favor she was doing, in a way that made every meal feel like a small transaction whose terms were never quite spoken aloud but were nonetheless perfectly understood by everyone at the table. Evelina was given the smallest portions, seated furthest from the fire, and expected, though never asked outright, to make herself useful, to mend, to read aloud to Frances's fretful younger children, to sit quietly in corners at the small gatherings Frances still held, present but not truly included, a poor relation whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. She had been, 3 months before, a young woman whose company every drawing-room in the county had competed for. She was now a young woman whom hostesses seated near the door. It was during this time, the grey months of that first winter, when the cold got into the small room under the eaves and Mary took in mending from the neighboring houses to earn what few extra shillings she could, refusing every time Evelina tried to insist she keep the money for herself, that Evelina learned the particular skill that would, though she did not know it yet, eventually save her. She learned to disappear. Not literally, though there were days she wished she could. She learned, rather, the art of making herself small and useful and unremarkable, of moving through a room without drawing attention, of enduring the small cruelties of Frances's circle, the pointed questions about her prospects, the barely concealed pity, the way certain young matrons would glance at her morning black gown, 3 seasons out of fashion by then, with an expression that was not quite contempt but was not far from it either, without ever once allowing her face to show what those cruelties cost her. She learned, in short, to survive. It was not, she would reflect much later, an ignoble skill. It asked a great deal of a person, more in its quiet way than any single dramatic act of courage, because it had to be performed again and again, every single day, with no audience to witness the performance and no reward at the end of it beyond simply having gotten through another day without breaking. But it was, in that first terrible winter, all she had. It was in February, 4 months after the night that had ended her old life, that the letter arrived which would change everything a second time, though not, at first, in any way that felt like good fortune. The letter came from a Mrs. Honoria Blackwood, a widow of considerable means who kept a large house in Bath and who had, Evelina gathered from Francis's excited chatter, something of a reputation as an eccentric, a woman who had inherited her late husband's shipping fortune at 35 and had spent the 20 years since running her own affairs with a shrewdness that scandalized and fascinated the town in roughly equal measure. Mrs. Blackwood required, the letter explained, a companion, someone of good breeding and education who could manage her correspondence, read to her in the evenings, accompany her to the assembly rooms, and generally provide the kind of intelligent company that Mrs. Blackwood found, she wrote with a bluntness Evelina would come to recognize as entirely characteristic, in desperately short supply among the empty-headed young women who currently comprised Bath society. I understand your circumstances, the letter continued, and I will say plainly what others will only whisper. Your father's ruin is not your ruin unless you permit it to be. I'm not offering you charity, Miss Ashworth. I am offering you a position with a fair wage in exchange for real work. I have made inquiries and am satisfied that you possess both sense and discretion. If you are interested, you may call upon me Thursday next. Francis, upon hearing of the letter, was appalled. A companion, she said, as though the word itself were faintly obscene. Evelina, you cannot. A companion is little better than a servant. What will people say? People, Evelina said, folding the letter with hands that, for the first time in months, did not feel entirely numb, have already said everything they intend to say about me, Francis. I do not think there is a great deal left for them to add. She went, on the Thursday, to Mrs. Blackwood's house on the Royal Crescent, a house grander in its way than Ashworth Hall had ever been, though it lacked the particular quality of ancestral weight that had made her father's house feel, however falsely, permanent, and she was shown into a drawing-room where a small, sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 55 sat very upright in a chair by the window, examining her with an attention so direct it bordered on rudeness. Sit down, Mrs. Blackwood said without preamble. I do not enjoy watching people hover. You are the Ashworth girl. I am, ma'am. Your father was a fool, Mrs. Blackwood said with the same brisk directness, though I am told he was not an unkind fool, which is more than can be said for a great many men who manage to keep their fortunes intact. I knew your mother slightly many years ago before she married. She had good sense. I am curious to discover whether you inherited any of it, or whether it skipped a generation entirely, as good sense so often does. Evelina, who had spent 4 months learning to absorb small cruelties without visible reaction, found herself, unexpectedly, fighting the urge to smile. There was something almost restful in Mrs. Blackwood's bluntness. No pretense, no careful cruelty disguised as pity, just plain speech, however sharp its edges. I could not say, ma'am, she answered, not having had much occasion these past months to exercise whatever sense I possess. I have mostly been occupied with learning to be poor, which is, I find, a rather full-time occupation in itself. Something flickered in Mrs. Blackwood's sharp eyes. Approval, Evelina realized, or something close to it. Good, the older woman said. An honest answer and a wry one. I detest simpering, Miss Ashworth, and I detest self-pity even more, though God knows you would have earned the right to a great deal of it. Now, can you write a clear hand? Can you manage figures? Can you read aloud without putting your listener to sleep? And can you hold your tongue when holding your tongue is the wiser course, even when every part of you wishes to speak? I believe so, ma'am, on all 4 counts. We shall see, Mrs. Blackwood said. The position pays £30 a year, with your board and a room of your own. A proper room, Miss Ashworth, not a servant's garret, since I do not intend to employ you as a servant. I intend to employ you as I would a junior partner in a business concern, which is, in effect, what my household is. You will begin Monday if you are willing. Evelina thought, briefly, of the small cold room under Francis's eaves, of the pointed silences at dinner, of the slow daily erosion of whatever remained of her sense of herself. I am willing, she said. Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. Don't thank me yet, the older woman said with the ghost of a smile. Thank me in a year if you still feel like thanking anyone. Now go home and pack your things. And bring that maid of yours, Fenwick, is it? I understand she has stayed with you through all of this without wages. That is not the behavior of an ordinary servant, Miss Ashworth. That is the behavior of a friend, and I do not employ households that fail to recognize the difference. The year that followed was, in its way, the strangest of Evelina's life, stranger even than the catastrophic months that had preceded it, because it was a year in which she was slowly, deliberately, almost forcibly remade. Mrs. Blackwood did not coddle her. From the first week, Evelina found herself managing correspondence that ranged far beyond the polite social notes she had once written as Lady Ashworth's daughter. Letters concerning shipping manifests, insurance claims, disputes with warehouse agents in Bristol, negotiations with captains whose cargo had been delayed by weather or war. She found herself, within a month, keeping a set of household accounts more complex than any her own father had apparently ever bothered to properly maintain, and she found, to her genuine surprise, that she was good at it, that the same careful, controlled mind which had gotten her through 4 months of silent humiliation at Francis's table was equally suited to columns of figures and careful negotiation. You have a head for business, Miss Ashworth, Mrs. Blackwood observed one evening, some 6 months into Evelina's employment, as they sat together reviewing a set of accounts by candlelight. It is a great pity you were born a woman in a world that will never let you use it properly. Though I intend to see how far I can push against that particular wall, while I am able. You have done a great deal already, ma'am, Evelina said. I was a woman with nothing 4 months ago. Now I am a woman with a position, a wage, and, she paused, surprised by her own admission, something rather like purpose, which I did not expect to feel again. Purpose, Mrs. Blackwood said, is not nothing, Miss Ashworth. In fact, I would argue it is very nearly everything. Fortunes can be lost in a single night, as you know better than most. But a mind that has learned to think clearly and a character that has learned to endure, those, once acquired, are considerably harder for the world to take from you. It was, Evelina reflected later, the truest thing anyone had said to her since her father's death. She did not remain entirely hidden from society during this time, though her position was, by the old measure, a diminished one. Mrs. Blackwood, for all her bluntness, kept an active house, and Evelina found herself, in her capacity as companion, present at assemblies and dinners and the various small entertainments of Bath's fashionable season, present, but now occupying a strange new position within them, neither fully a guest nor fully a servant, but something else, a woman observed and quietly respected, for her evident usefulness and her equally evident composure. It was at one such assembly in the spring of the second year, some 17 months after the night that had destroyed her old life, that Evelina encountered Julian Vane again. She saw him before he saw her, across the crowded assembly room, and felt, in the space of that first glance, a whole complicated cascade of emotion she had not expected still to be capable of feeling. Not longing, precisely, though there was an echo of the old affection somewhere in it, but something closer to a cool, assessing curiosity, as though she were looking at a portrait of someone she had once known very well and had since, without quite realizing it, stopped being. He saw her a moment later, and she watched color rise in his face, not the flush of pleasure but something closer to shame. He crossed the room to her with visible effort, as though wading through water. Miss Ashworth, he said, bowing. I had not expected to see you here. Lord Vane. She inclined her head with perfect, practiced composure. The composure of a woman who has spent a year and a half learning that her face need never show what she does not wish it to show. How do you do? I have thought of you often, he said in a low voice, glancing about as though afraid of being overheard, which struck Evelina in that moment as almost unbearably telling. I want you to know that I did not wish, that is, my mother's decision was not. Lord Vane, Evelina interrupted, gently but with perfect finality, you need not explain yourself to me. It was a long time ago, and I find I have very little interest these days in explanations that arrive 18 months too late to matter. She saw something in his face crumple very slightly, regret perhaps or simple embarrassment, but she felt, to her own quiet surprise, no corresponding pang of triumph or satisfaction. Only a kind of distant pity, and beneath that, something calmer and more solid. The simple recognition that this man whom she had once believed she could not live without, was in fact a person she had lived quite entirely without for a year and a half, and had not merely survived the absence but had, in some way she was only beginning to understand, grown because of it. I hope, she said more gently now because there was no longer any need for coldness, "That you are well, Lord Vane. Truly. I bear you no ill will." And she meant it. That, perhaps, was the most surprising discovery of the whole evening, not that she could face him without flinching, but that she genuinely did not wish him harm. He had been weak, in the end, when weakness cost him nothing and cost her everything. But weakness was not the same as cruelty, and Evelina had, by then, learned to recognize real cruelty rather too well to waste it on a man who had merely failed to be brave. She excused herself a few minutes later, and crossed the room to rejoin Mrs. Blackwood, who watched her return with a sharp, assessing look. "Well?" the older woman asked. "You look remarkably composed for a woman who has just spoken to the man who abandoned her." "I find," Evelina said, and was surprised to hear that it was entirely true, "that I no longer particularly care what he thinks of me. I'm not certain when that happened. But I am rather glad it has." Mrs. Blackwood's mouth curved into something that was, for her, an unusually warm smile. "That, Miss Ashworth," she said, "is the sound of a woman who has finally stopped waiting for her old life to come back and started building a new one instead. It is a very good sound. I have been waiting to hear it from you for some months now." It would be a comfortable ending at this point in the story, to say that Evelina's fortunes rose steadily from that evening forward, that having survived the worst of her trials she was permitted, by whatever grants such permissions, a smooth and untroubled path toward whatever happiness awaited her. Life, however, and this is a truth Evelina had learned rather more thoroughly than most young women her age, rarely arranges itself into such tidy shapes. The second storm came not from without as the first had, but from a source far closer to home and far more painful for being so. It began with a letter. Letters, it seemed, were forever the messengers of catastrophe in Evelina's life, from Mr. Fry, her father's old solicitor, who had continued, out of long habit and genuine affection for the family he had served for 30 years, to keep half an eye on matters relating to the old Ashworth estate, even though his formal duties toward it had long since ended. "My dear Miss Ashworth," the letter began, in Mr. Fry's careful, old-fashioned hand, "I write to you with information that I believe you would wish to have, however painful its implications may prove. In the course of some unrelated business, I have come into possession of certain papers relating to your father's final debts, specifically the loans extended to him by Mr. Josiah Crane, the moneylender whose claims formed the largest single portion of the estate's liabilities. I must tell you with great regret that these papers raise serious questions I had not previously had occasion to examine. The interest rates applied to your father's later loans were, by any reasonable legal standard, usurious, far in excess of what the law permits, even accounting for the considerable risk Mr. Crane was undertaking. More troublingly still, I have found evidence. I stress that it is not yet conclusive, but it is substantial, that at least 2 of the later notes of hand bearing your father's signature may not, in fact, be genuine. I have compared the signatures with unquestioned examples from your father's correspondence, and there are discrepancies that trouble me deeply. In plain terms, Miss Ashworth, I believe it possible, even probable, that your father's final and most catastrophic debts, the very debts that led directly to the loss of the Hall, and very possibly to his despair on the night he took his own life, may have been, in part, fraudulent. I believe your father may have been the victim of a deliberate scheme by Mr. Crane to inflate his obligations beyond what he had actually borrowed, precisely because Crane understood that a man already drowning in shame would not have the fortitude to dispute the figures, and would simply pay or attempt to pay whatever sum was presented to him. I do not raise this to reopen old wounds without cause. I raise it because, if I am correct, there may be grounds, legal grounds, to challenge the validity of the debts that consumed your father's estate, and in time to recover at least a portion of what was lost. I would be glad to discuss this further at your convenience. I remain as ever your father's faithful servant and yours, Aldous Fry. Evelina read the letter 3 times, standing very still in the small sitting room Mrs. Blackwood had given over to her private use, and felt something she had not permitted herself to feel in 18 months rise up through her chest like floodwater breaking a dam. Not grief this time. Fury. It is a peculiar thing to grieve a person and then discover, more than a year later, that at least part of the catastrophe that destroyed them was not entirely their own doing, that the shame they carried to their grave, the shame that drove a desperate man to a cold river on an October night, may have been manufactured deliberately and cynically by another man who understood exactly how to exploit that shame for profit. Evelina had spent 18 months making a careful, difficult peace with the idea that her father had been a fool, a weak man, a foolish man, a man whose vanity and denial had cost his only daughter everything she had ever known. It had been a painful peace, but it had been, at least, a peace she understood, one she could hold in her hands and examine and slowly learn to carry. The idea that her father might also have been preyed upon, that his weakness had been identified and deliberately exploited by a man who saw in his desperation not a fellow human being in crisis but simply an opportunity for profit. This was a different kind of pain altogether, sharper and colder, and it burned through the calm composure Evelina had spent a year and a half so carefully constructing. She took the letter to Mrs. Blackwood that same evening. The older woman read it twice, her sharp eyes moving carefully over every line, and when she finished, she set it down on the table between them with a small, deliberate precision that Evelina had come to recognize, in her time in this household, as the outward sign of Mrs. Blackwood's considerable inward anger. Josiah Crane, Mrs. Blackwood said in a voice gone very cold and flat, is not unknown to me, Miss Ashworth. I have heard his name before, in connection with at least 2 other estates ruined under circumstances that, at the time, struck me as rather too convenient to be entirely accidental. I did not, I confess, connect his name to your father's case until this moment, because I did not know the particulars. I know them now. What? Evelina asked, her voice carefully controlled, though her hands in her lap were not. Do you believe should be done? I believe, Mrs. Blackwood said, that you should go to London with Mr. Fry, and with whatever evidence he has assembled, and that you should not rest until Josiah Crane is made to answer for what he has done, not merely to your father but I would wager a considerable sum to others besides. I believe you have spent 18 months learning patience and composure and quiet endurance, Miss Ashworth, and you have learned those lessons very well. I believe it is now time to learn a rather different lesson, how to fight openly for what is owed to you. I have no standing to fight anyone, Evelina said. I am an unmarried woman with no fortune and no legal power of my own. What weight could my word possibly carry against a man of Crane's wealth and connection? Mrs. Blackwood's expression did not soften, but something in it warmed all the same, the particular warmth of a woman who has been waiting a long time to say something important. You have my weight, Miss Ashworth, she said. You have my fortune, my connections, and, since you have clearly proven this past year and more that you have earned it, my complete confidence. I did not build a shipping fortune from nothing as a widow, in a world determined to hand every advantage to men, by believing that a woman without a husband is a woman without power. I built it by understanding very early that power is not given. It is taken carefully by those with the wit and the will to take it. You have both, my dear, you have simply not yet had the occasion to use them fully. I believe that occasion has now arrived. What followed was not the swift, satisfying justice of a storybook, but something slower and more grinding, the true, unglamorous shape of a fight for justice against a wealthy and well-connected man, conducted through solicitors and careful documentation and a great many long frustrating months in which victory seemed, at various points, entirely out of reach. Mr. Fry, with Mrs. Blackwood's considerable financial backing, engaged a barrister of some reputation, and together they began the slow work of building a case, comparing signatures, tracing the movement of funds, interviewing, discreetly, 2 other families who had suffered similarly catastrophic losses at Josiah Crane's hands and who had, until now, each believed their own ruin to be simply the ordinary consequence of a relative's weakness, rather than part of a deliberate and repeated scheme. It was slow, exhausting work, and Evelina, who insisted, against Mrs. Blackwood's initial reservations, on being present for every meeting, every review of documents, every difficult conversation, found in it a strange kind of purpose that went far beyond simple revenge. She was not merely fighting to restore her father's reputation, though that mattered to her more than she could easily have put into words. She was fighting, she came to understand, for every family that had been quietly, deliberately destroyed by a man who understood that shame keeps its victims silent, and who had built his fortune on precisely that silence. The case against Josiah Crane was not, in the end, decided in a single dramatic courtroom scene, however satisfying such a scene might be to imagine. It was decided gradually, through the accumulation of evidence too substantial to ignore, through the quiet but considerable pressure that a woman of Mrs. Blackwood's connections could bring to bear, and through the growing willingness of Crane's other victims, emboldened by the knowledge that they were not alone, to come forward and add their own testimony to the mounting case against him. Crane fought it, of course, with every resource his wealth could provide. But wealth, Evelina learned in those long months, is not the same as unassailability, and a man who has built his fortune on fraud is, in the end, always vulnerable to the one thing he cannot fully control. The truth, once enough people have the courage to speak it aloud together. It took the better part of a year. But in the autumn of the 2nd year after her father's death, almost precisely 2 years, Evelina would later note, from the night that had destroyed her old life, Josiah Crane was formally ruined, his fraudulent lending practices exposed in a legal judgment that stripped him of the greater part of his fortune and left his name, in the drawing rooms and coffee houses of London, a byword for exactly the kind of predatory cruelty he had spent decades disguising as ordinary business. And Evelina Ashworth, no longer in any sense that mattered, the frightened young woman who had stood in her father's empty study with a trembling candle 2 years before, was awarded, through a settlement that Mr. Fry negotiated with quiet, careful skill, a sum that did not restore Ashworth Hall to her. That house, rebuilt and altered beyond recognition by its new owner, was gone forever, and Evelina found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not entirely mourn it, but that was, nonetheless, more than sufficient to secure her a genuine independence. A small but comfortable income entirely her own, requiring her never again to depend on any man's mercy, or any relative's grudging charity, for the roof over her head. There is a particular kind of strength that can only be forged in loss, not the loss itself, which teaches nothing on its own beyond how to endure pain, but the long, difficult, unglamorous work of rebuilding that comes after, the daily choice, repeated across many gray mornings, to keep going when giving up would be so very much easier. Evelina Ashworth did not become, in the years that followed, a woman without sorrow. She carried her father's memory always, not merely the memory of his weakness and his fatal desperation, but the memory of his kindness too, the man who had taught her to ride, who had laughed at her jokes, who had, in his own flawed and ultimately tragic way, loved her more than he had loved his own dignity, and had proven it, in the end, in the worst possible way a father can prove such a thing. But she carried, alongside that sorrow, something else as well, a hard-won understanding of her own capacity, tested and proven across 2 of the most difficult years any young woman of her station could be asked to endure. She had lost, in a single night, everything she had ever believed defined her: her home, her fortune, her betrothal, her place in the world she had been raised to inhabit. And she had discovered, in the long aftermath of that loss, that none of those things had ever truly been the foundation of who she was. They had been circumstances, comfortable, pleasant circumstances, which she did not pretend to regret losing any less for understanding this. But circumstances all the same, and circumstances, however catastrophically they might be stripped away, cannot take a person's character with them. She remained with Mrs. Blackwood for several years more, no longer merely a companion but something closer to a true partner in the older woman's various enterprises, her sharp mind and steady judgment increasingly indispensable to the management of a fortune that continued, under their combined attention, to grow rather than diminish. Mary Fenwick remained with her always, no longer merely a maid but, in every sense that mattered, family, the 2 women having built, across the hardest years of both their lives, a bond that no ordinary difference in station had ever managed to diminish. And when, some 4 years after that terrible October night, Evelina did eventually marry, not Julian Vane, who had gone on, she heard, to make a perfectly ordinary and perfectly unremarkable match with a young woman of suitable fortune, but a widowed barrister some years her senior named Mr. Henry Calloway, a quiet, serious man who had been part of the legal team that brought down Josiah Crane, and who had watched Evelina, across that long and difficult year, not with the easy, careless admiration Julian had once offered her, but with a deep and growing respect for a woman who had faced total ruin and had, through nothing but her own courage and her own hard-won clarity of mind, built herself an entirely new life from the wreckage. When Evelina did marry, it was not from desperation, or from any need to secure her position in the world. It was, for the first time in her life, entirely and freely her own choice, made by a woman who no longer needed a husband's fortune or a father's name to know exactly who she was. On the morning of her wedding, a small, quiet affair, nothing like the grand society occasion her marriage to Julian Vane would once have been, but infinitely more precious to her for its very simplicity, Evelina stood before her mirror while Mary fastened the last of the small pearl buttons at her back, and caught sight, for just a moment, of the length of rose-colored silk that had once, in another life entirely, been meant for another wedding to another man. She had kept it all these years tucked away at the bottom of one of her 2 remaining trunks, not out of sentiment for what it had once represented, but as a private reminder of everything that had happened since. The girl who had chosen it, laughing, on the last ordinary afternoon of her old life, and the woman she had become in the 2 hard years that followed, a woman that girl could never have imagined and would, Evelina liked to think, have been rather proud to meet. "Any regrets, my lady?" Mary asked softly, watching her in the mirror, the old title used now with deliberate, teasing affection, a private joke between the 2 of them, since Evelina had long ago stopped thinking of herself as anyone's lady in the way the word had once meant. Evelina considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things now, turning it over carefully before answering. "I lost everything I thought I could not live without in a single night," she said at last. "My home, my fortune, my father. The whole shape of the life I believed had been laid out for me since birth. I would not wish that night on anyone, Mary, not even, God forgive me, on Julian's mother, whatever cruelty she showed me in her letter. But I find, looking back on it now, that I cannot entirely wish it undone either. Because I do not think I ever would have discovered what I was actually capable of, if I had not first been made to lose everything I believed I needed simply to survive." She turned from the mirror and reached for Mary's hand, not her lady's maid's hand, not any longer, but her oldest and truest friend's, and smiled with the particular, hard-won steadiness of a woman who has walked through the very worst that fortune can inflict, and has come out the other side not diminished, but entirely, unshakably herself. "I lost everything that night," she said, "and in losing it I finally found out who I truly was underneath it all. I would not trade that discovery now, Mary. Not for any fortune in England. They say that character is not made in comfort, but revealed and forged in crisis, that the truest measure of a person is not how they behave when fortune smiles upon them, but how they endure when fortune turns cruel and takes, in a single merciless night, everything they believed defined them. Lady Evelina Ashworth lost her home, her fortune, her father, and her betrothal within the span of a single autumn, in circumstances that would have broken many a stronger-seeming person entirely. She was not spared the grief of that loss, nor the long, grinding difficulty of rebuilding a life from its wreckage. But she discovered, in the 2 hardest years of her life, a strength she had never known she possessed, and she used that strength in the end not merely to survive, but to see justice done, to build an independence entirely her own, and to become a woman infinitely more formidable and infinitely more herself than the sheltered girl who had once sat choosing ribbon on the last ordinary afternoon of her old life. She lost everything in one night. And in the years that followed, piece by difficult piece, she built something better in its place. Not the life she had been promised, but the life she had earned, with her own courage, her own clear-eyed judgment, and her own unbreakable will.